I think mission is so important. And at the Bridge to Excellence conference yesterday, I found myself in a conversation with another leader about, how important using mission and vision as your compass. We have an organizational mission and vision at CNE. I have a personal mission. And so when I think about, as I entertain different things that come up, either or, if it's, something professionally or organizationally, I think about, does it align with our mission at CNE? And if we can answer yes, to that question, then that's the most important first step. And then personally, I have a focus for driving community impact and enhancing opportunities for women. Those are two things that are important to me. And so that's what I consider when making a decision whether or not to take on an opportunity.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Catalysts for Change, the show where we explore the stories, strategies, and turning points of leaders driving meaningful impact in their communities and across the country. I'm Adam Lister, and I'm so glad you're here. Today's guest is someone working at the intersection of leadership, talent development, and long-term institutional impact. Meagan Flippin has built her career around a central idea that meaningful change doesn't just come from policy or programs, it comes from people, and more specifically, from how we identify, develop, and invest in leaders over time. Her work is focused on strengthening leadership pipelines, shaping how organizations think about talent, and helping individuals step into roles where they can create outsized impact in their communities. In today's episode, we'll talk about how leaders are actually formed, not just trained, but shaped, what it takes to build systems that constantly produce strong leadership, and what individuals can do to position themselves for meaningful impact. Let's dive in. Meagan, thank you for being here today. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to see you as well.
Well, I'd love to start at the beginning of your career. Before your current work in leadership development, what pulled you into this space? I always think about when I have a guest that's in kind of a non-traditional career path that you wouldn't find on an academic bulletin. What were the things that kind of triggered you to find this interesting, and the steps that you took to go down the path that you have gone down?
Sure. I've always been interested in leadership. That has always been very much part of who I am. Early on, took on leadership roles in middle school and high school and into college. And my first career opportunity out of undergrad was to work in the Office of Leadership and Service at Middle Tennessee State University. And I think that's where my interest in this area only further grew. And we had the opportunity to work also with a lot of nonprofit organizations in partnership with the university. So that really blended my interest in nonprofit work as well as leadership development. From there, I went on and worked for the Musicians Hall of Fame here in Nashville, and then went and worked for the United Way Network for about 14 years before coming to the Center for Nonprofit Excellence just about 2 years ago.
Throughout that process, you had the opportunity to be in some pretty significant community institutions
Mhm.
and organizations that are plugged into a diverse set of aspects in the community, particularly in Middle Tennessee. What were some of the experiences or the individuals or the lessons that you were able to take part with and learn through that period of time that helped shape how you think about leadership today?
Throughout my life, I've been really fortunate to have a lot of great role models and learn from many different leaders. And I think as each of us develop as leaders, we're taking fragments of other people whom we've interacted with or worked with or learned from. We're taking fragments of their behaviors, their style, their leadership approaches, and using it to build our very own leadership style. So I've had that opportunity to be able to do that. When I was in undergrad, my major was public relations and journalism. And so I remember one of my professors saying, when it comes to the word obscene, it's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. And I think leadership is very much the same way. It can be really hard to define in a very concise way, but you know it when you see it. So when I see people who seem like they're really demonstrating leadership, and it can be a variety of different styles or ways in which they seem to demonstrate that leadership, I really take note. I enjoy learning about and reading biographies, autobiographies of different leaders, and just really getting a grasp for how they approached their leadership roles.
Yeah, it's interesting. You think about, you know it when you see it. I would also say you know it when you feel it as
Yes.
well. But it's also interesting. I had the opportunity to be part of a breakout session at your annual
Mhm.
conference recently, and there was a question in that seminar about a particular strategy that we were talking about. We were talking
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
board members as strategic thought partners. And one of the participants asked, well, how do you know when to go down this path or versus going down that path? And it occurred to me that it's so dependent on both the individual, in the case that I was talking about, the
Mhm.
individual leader of the organization, but then also the leaders of the board and how they receive and give information. Those leadership strategies have to be dynamic as you're thinking about, I may approach leadership in this way, but there might need to be some edits around the edge. I also was thinking about as you're observing these and kind of taking notes over time. I had a conversation recently about the evolution of how we think about social media,
Mhm.
and in particular, how my generation thought about it and how we curated our online profiles and reputations versus how a college student today and their generation might think about social media.
Mhm.
And we didn't necessarily know in 2000 and 2001 and 2002 that our understandings were wrong or not necessarily setting ourselves up for reputational success. But those misunderstandings are pretty obvious now.
Mhm.
I'm curious, as you're talking about what you observed, it made me kind of think back to this social media conversation. What were some of the misunderstandings that you had about leadership early on? Things that you just believed or were confident to be true that over the course of your career, you've said, upon reflection, I think that there's
Mhm.
actually a different or a better way to go about this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will preface with most anything that I say or any perspective that I have probably comes from the fact that I got it wrong early on, just like your social media example. It's all about learning, and I do think that's a big part of leadership is it's just this continual learning cycle, and it's a lot about ownership too and owning that learning cycle. I think early on, I think with young leaders, and I had the opportunity to move into an executive leadership role at a pretty young age, but you think about leadership a little bit more around the title, the authority. Hey, I'm going to put this on paper and then it'll be executed. And oftentimes, I think it's easy to underestimate the importance of people and relational skills in leadership. And not that those would not maybe necessarily have been important to me, they certainly were. But I think you really have to have an understanding to how to move people forward in a way that helps them grow, in a way that makes the organization effective. And it can be messy. I just came from another meeting where we were having a conversation about a different initiative, and we talked about the messy in the middle. And I think human nature, we like things to be very black and white and just very much, this or that. And leadership is none of that. It's very much gray areas. You have to be comfortable with not being comfortable. You have to really be able to have some self awareness and look internally and know that you, just because you're in a leadership role, that you also have opportunities for improvement as well. And I think early on, as a leader, I thought, you've got to have all the answers. You got to know what to do in a situation and be the decision maker. And as I've grown, I've realized, when I make decisions, I try to get perspective from other people who are involved or other people who may be affected by that decision. That may not be possible 100% of the time, but I think it's really important to get buy in from those around you and the decision making that you have to do as a leader. So I would say probably the biggest shortcoming was really just underestimating the importance of engaging people in the role of leadership and how you apply different principles and how you move forward as a leader.
It kind of leads me into my next curiosity. We talked a little bit about kind of your specific experience and how you think about it. But a lot of organizations, high performing organizations, and sometimes not so high performing organizations, talk a lot about leadership development
Mhm.
within their
Mhm.
institutions, within their staff. But in practice, a lot of organizations really struggle to do it well.
Mhm.
And maybe they know they struggle to do it well, maybe they
Mhm.
don't. I'm curious from your perspective, you've got line of sight into hundreds of nonprofit organizations of varying sizes. What are you seeing that actually builds really effective leadership? inside organizations as they're trying to drive community impact?
I go back to building people. Leaders can build plans, they can build systems, but if you haven't built people alongside that, it's going to be really hard to be effective. Um, I'm a believer that people are the carriers of culture. So, regardless of what infrastructure, what goals, what resources you may have at your fingertips, if you haven't appropriately brought people along with you, whether that's your staff, your board, depending on your organization, volunteers, donors, whatever that may be, if you haven't brought the people along with you and the vision and the plans, then you're really setting your organization up for failure.
So I see that as kind of developing talent
Mhm.
in a variety of ways, maybe from a skill perspective, from a leadership perspective. Where have you seen some of the best examples, either in your own practice or in organizations you've been a part of or helped to nurture with CNE that are doing it really well, that are really developing that talent in a way that helps advance both the mission of the organization and then builds out that leadership culture?
Mhm. So I would say there has to be buy-in from the leader that talent development is important to the organization. And I'm a believer that when you're through investing in your people, you're just through, period, as an organization. Now, I know organizations may go through periods where they have layoffs or have to downsize. I heard the phrase yesterday, shrink to survive sometimes. But with the people that you have at hand, you really still have to continue to invest in them directly as a leader. I think it's really important. Um, and where I've seen success is when in the nonprofit space, employees know that the leader wants the best for them, whether that leader is their supervisor, the CEO of the organization, whatever that structure may look like. At the end of the day, when they're holding them accountable, when they are giving them some difficult feedback or having those tough conversations, I think as long as that person knows that this is happening because this person wants me to be better in the future and be able to better, address the situation going forward. I think that's really important. I think sometimes we tend to outsource leadership development and talent development, and that's important too. It's important for people to go to conferences and classes and the trainings like CNE provides. But I think there also has to be relationships internally between leaders in the organizations and employees that are developed on trust and relationships. There is that saying that people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, which I know often sounds cliche, but there's so much truth to that. And leaders just have to be really invested in the people and care about moving them forward and not just what that person can do for the bottom line.
Yeah, I think knowing those sorts of things and living
Mhm.
that knowledge can be a challenge. I would often find myself thinking about why certain things weren't happening or
Mhm.
challenges along the way, and I'm like, gosh, I've said this 10 times, or I've suggested to our team or to our staff or to even our children, as an
Mhm.
example, that we are going to do this or we can do this. You can say whatever you want. We're an open book. And realizing that the language that you use to help
Mhm.
people understand kind of definitionally how you want them to show up is only part of how you actually get them to
Mhm.
show up. That
Mhm.
if you tell them that these are the things you want them to do, but everything about the way that you respond
Mhm.
when they try to show up in that way is doing more to train or to kind of uh, 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 interrupt the progress that you're trying to make. And I see that especially in high stakes moments
Mhm.
when things are
Emotions are
moving
running
quickly, emotions
high,
are high.
tensions high.
Right. How can you think about the difference between someone who has the ability to lead in kind of a softer, gentler space when things are going really well, and may be able to take that sort of a passive role, and what comes out or what is necessary when it actually becomes uh, uh, important in a high stakes moment to be super effective? Where do you see someone moving from good to great or
Mhm.
good to not so great? What kind of lays at the intersection of that shift?
So I believe leaders have to understand they are always setting the example 24/7. And it's really easy to be a good leader when the waters are calm. It's in those moments when there's adversity or the waters are choppy that people really start to pay attention. And oftentimes they emulate whatever the leader is kind of broadcasting in terms of how they're handling a situation. Um, as you will know, we had our conference yesterday. And as we talked about a moment ago, we found out late on Monday that our keynote speaker, whom we had scheduled many months ago and had really promoted that the conference, wasn't going to be able to make it due to a family emergency. And when the employee that was responsible for coordinating the speaker came in to tell me, I could tell that they were very nervous and, really panicked about the situation. And I tried to remain as calm as possible because I didn't want to suddenly drive their panic further
Like, okay,
and make
what's next?
them, yeah, exactly. I said, okay, well, we can't control this situation. So what are some options and what can we do about it? And I immediately could tell that they calmed down because I didn't further perpetuate their panic, and it all worked out, and it was all fine. It's not, it wasn't anything to get too concerned about because we couldn't control it. And human nature, sometimes I do feel like we forget what we can control and what we can't. I think the pandemic reminded us what we can't control, but I would say a big driver in helping people move forward and saying things a certain way or saying I've communicated this, but it's how you communicate, the tone you use, the questions you ask. It's not necessarily the words that were used or the message that was conveyed, but you have to think about how you're delivering that. There are conversations, that could easily be an email, but sometimes should not be an email. They need to be a face to face or in person conversation. And then there are some things that, can be an email. And I try to be really thoughtful about different people's styles and how I approach them. I know when I have to have a tough conversation with certain people, the way to approach it is, being very, just, getting right to it and just saying what the issue is and having the conversation. I know with some others, I kind of need to warm them up before getting to the tough part of the conversation. And I think leaders have to understand their people enough to know how they need to approach a situation, a conversation, or an interaction to make it the most effective and have the outcome that they desire. Because you can't have a one size fits all approach.
Yeah. I think about your employee that comes to you anxious about the news about a
Hmm.
keynote
Hmm.
speaker. In that moment, to that employee who has some responsibility
Hmm.
on the success of the event, this may feel like a fatal miss and just catastrophic to the event. And I think what you're able to do is I'm just kind of like diagnosing this or kind of observing this both in real time. As I mentioned to you, I was sitting in the room kind of watching some of this happen as you all were preparing that that keynote speaker was important to the
Hmm.
event.
Hmm.
They had a message you wanted to deliver, but they weren't central to the mission of what you were trying to accomplish
Right.
that day, which gives you as the leader permission to say, okay, we can adjust here and still reach our goal. And then to your point, it gives the employee the opportunity to say, I'm not going to be punished for someone else's kind of uncontrolled miss. Number
Mhm.
one, laid out best effort. This wasn't a process problem that we've completely missed.
Right, right.
And without speaking those words directly, it's like, oh, we can still have a really solid event. We can
Exactly.
still accomplish the things that we set out to accomplish. You I've seen, and you've talked a little bit about it here, that some of the themes in your leadership work is focusing on the individual, but then also building structures and systems for
Mhm.
how
Mhm.
to help that be successful. When you look at an organization or some sort of movement within a nonprofit space, is there something that jumps out at you or that you look for to help identify a healthy leadership pipeline that you can see to say this organization or this
Mhm.
work is succeeding now and will succeed in the future? Because I can see these things that show me that they've got a really good, solid pipeline into the future.
One thing I look at and one thing that I tried to in my own organizations where I've worked, put into practice is if an employee has come into your organization in a certain role with a certain level of responsibility, and 10 years later they have the exact same role and responsibility, I don't think you've really done that person, that you've really served them well. I think it's important for people to grow, that they continue to move around in the organization. And I had a leader early on. My background was the PR marketing track is kind of how I entered the workforce. Well, over time, I suddenly became responsible for programs, and then at one point had some responsibility for HR, and then was touching a lot of different parts of the organization, the exception of maybe accounting, which I was okay with that. But by the time I had the opportunity to move into an executive leadership role, it was like I had this diversity and experience from a lot of different angles of the organization. And so I really have tried to replicate that with employees as they grow, to constantly give them new opportunities to have exposure, to have visibility, to kind of enhance their knowledge base and their responsibility. A lot of that just comes through experience. Like I said earlier, I think there's a both and in leadership development in terms of sending people to conferences, trainings, leadership programs, cohorts, that sort of thing. But a lot of it's also experiential learning and kind of on the job type learning as well. I'd love to know a little bit more about some of the things that you've seen or that you mentioned that you look for.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it starts with the leader, but then how they respond to ideas on their team.
Yes.
That the when I think about a CEO, I would tell folks all the time that I wasn't hired to because I was the best lobbyist. I wasn't hired because I was the best policy analyst, or you kind of go down the list of things. I was hired because of your ability to cast a vision and your ability to catalyze people around that vision.
Mhm. Mhm.
There's a whole lot of other stuff that kind of gets
Mhm.
put under there. So when I think about, can I evaluate whether or not a person has the potential to be an effective CEO? The first thing I want to know is, do they have the ability to cast a vision?
Yeah.
And can they articulate where they want to go? What is the North Star? And is it realistic? Like, are we living on planet Earth, but also aspirationally are we trying to get to the dark side of the moon?
Mhm. Mhm.
On the pipeline side, what I'm curious about is, in that meeting that you're in, is that leader allowing and inviting their teams to also own spaces of the work?
Yeah.
And are they deferring to that team member to be content area experts, and recognizing that that team member has the ability to cast kind of mini visions around this
Mhm.
other space?
Mhm.
And the reason I
Mhm.
think that that's valuable is because it allows for diversity of thought in a room. It means that we're not doing
Yes.
something that the one leader has come up with. It also suggests to me that we've got critical thinkers around a table.
Yes.
And when you've got some critical thinkers around that table, we've got folks that are, you've got an open culture, you've got a dynamic exchange of ideas. And certainly that's like one fraction of the equation, and there's a lot that you would still, I think, need to double click on. But it tells me, oh, we've probably got a pretty good, healthy relationship
Yes.
among folks here. And you've got some content area experts, and you've also got people that understand how their work connects to the broader vision. And I think that there's a lot to start from and work from in that situation.
I agree with that, and I'll elaborate a little more because I mentioned earlier, as a young leader, I thought, oh, you've got to have all the answers. You got to know exactly what needs to be done next. People are looking for you to say, this is what we're going to do. And there are times where that's the case, but I appreciate what you said about how they're receptive to ideas because I think that's a way in which I've grown as a leader. And even in times where maybe I have experienced something before and it didn't work that way or kind of already went down a path a certain way, and then somebody has the idea to do it that way, I try to catch myself before saying, well, we've tried it that way, it didn't work, or, I've done it like that and it was a flop, and just say, well, tell me why you think we should do that. I try to ask more questions, and then eventually I may share the perspective of, well, we did it this way, but perhaps if we did it a little differently with what you've suggested, it might work this time or be different this time. But that is a way in which I feel like I've really probably grown as a leader over the last 15 or 20 years is, really asking the right questions and not being so quick to say, well, that won't work, and making sure that they feel like then they can speak up. Because I think the more you shoot down ideas, the less they're going to be offered up.
Yeah. Your point about questions makes me think about my kids, and the things that you say often get reflected back to you. Sometimes I think because the lesson lands, and sometimes because they want to mock their parent. But
Mhm.
I will regularly hear my kids recite back to me a refrain, ask better questions.
Yes.
And they may ask something and they don't like the answer that
Mhm,
they get.
mhm.
And the thing that I will tell them is, in my experience, kind of my professional training is answer the question you're asked.
Mhm.
That is it.
Mhm.
Don't assume that you know the pretext, and don't accept the premise of a question if
Mhm.
you're in kind of a lobbying or
Yep.
advocacy perspective. But my kids might ask a question, what are we doing after dinner? What my daughter may want to know is, at what point in the day can I get Jenny's chocolate ice cream?
That's a
And
very important
it's an
question.
important question, but it's the wrong one.
Yeah.
So my point to her is, you need to ask better questions, because if I say, I could answer that in a number of ways. I could say, we're going to walk the dog, we're going to go to bed, we're going to watch Survivor, whatever the case may be. None of those tell her that she's going to get or not get the thing she wants. And she very well may be disappointed. So if you want to get a specific answer to a thing, ask better questions. And I think the leadership approach is very similar, that if you want to help your team be better, you need to both ask quietly better questions about where are their strengths, where are their gaps, and then how can we fill those in.
Mhm.
But then also ask questions, to your example, what might be different in the context this time that wasn't
Exactly.
relevant last time, that could make this thing successful. I think a lot of people assume that just because they're good in a role, or that, to your point, they've been in an organization for a while, that they're going to rise up
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
corporate ladder, or that nonprofit ladder, or whatever the case may be. And as I'm kind of preempting this question, I'm thinking of a handful of people that have worked for me in the past that um, were missing opportunities to
Mhm.
increase their responsibilities, because we were missing opportunities to meet our current responsibilities. What I'm curious to know is, in your experience, how true that is, and what is the kind of secret sauce, or the thing that helps catalyze folks that are doing good work, and how do you get them to kind of continue to go up that ladder, from a leadership perspective, while
Mhm.
also recognizing it's tempting from a leadership perspective to say, and this person is really, really good at social media, or this person
Mhm.
is really, really good at outreach work. If I lose them here, I lose a critical component. Walk me through how you balance yeah, they're good at this thing, they're just going to rise naturally, versus how do you think about this being more of an active investment in their
Mhm.
futures?
Mhm. Something I look at in terms of talent development, I look at this when I interview people too. It may be a little harder to gauge through an interview process, but I definitely ask questions to try to kind of get a feel. Is some concepts from Patrick Lencioni's book, The Ideal Team Player, and it's about being hungry, humble, and smart. When someone is hungry and they want to take initiative, they want to do more, they're constantly thinking about what could be versus the status quo and just checking boxes all day long. When they're humble, they're about being the team player. They want what's best for the organization and for the team, even if it is not necessarily always giving them certain recognition or putting them in places of visibility or whatever that may be. And then being smart, and not necessarily smart in an intellectual academic sense, but smart with people, smart in how to make decisions, smart in how they go about their work every day, and prioritize their responsibilities and taking ownership of their responsibilities. And so when I see somebody that's, hitting at least a couple or more of those areas, I'm like, this is somebody that's got potential to move into a leadership role. And I would rather have a 10 for 2 years than a 2 for 10 years. So if there is somebody that is really great, chances are they may move on at some point to another opportunity. And my job is to help make them the best employee they can be, whether they're with me for 2 years or 10 years. That's what I feel like the responsibility of a leader is to think about, how can I make this person the best professional that they can be while I have them?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the reality is, Um, Bureau of Labor Statistics will tell you they're going to be with you for 2 years either way.
Mhm.
So you'd rather have a 10 for 2 than a 2 for 2.
Yeah,
Also,
exactly.
you have worked in environments where change has to happen within the existing system, not outside of it.
Mhm.
What have you learned about driving change and improvement inside those institutions that weren't necessarily built or may have been ready for it, but weren't necessarily built for success?
I think a really important aspect of change that is sometimes underestimated is communication. I think people can often deal with what they know. It's much more difficult for them to deal with what they don't know. And I think this is an area, again, where I've grown as a leader too, is recognizing that. And so going through change in a variety of the organizations that I worked within, but just thinking about my most recent experience, really trying to convey to the stakeholders on a regular basis, what was happening, why we were making that decision, why we are moving in that direction. But oftentimes, it wasn't the first time they were hearing it because, as I mentioned earlier, we had taken the steps to ask for feedback before making those decisions. So it was then more of we asked, we listened to what you said, and this is where we are as a result. I think there's a fine line with change too about moving too fast or too slow with it. I think either or could be detrimental. So there's just a really kind of tricky spot in terms of defining the pace of change, depending on all the factors that are at play. In my most recent experience, we needed to speed it up a little bit and have more of a fast track. In my last organization, we had the luxury that we could go a little bit slower with some of the change that we wanted to introduce just because of where we were as an organization. And we felt like because of the type of changes that we were introducing in that organization, we needed to do it a little more incrementally. So I think that has to be taken into consideration is the pace and the communication with all stakeholders, not just necessarily employees. And you got to think about board members, donors, and be really thoughtful about who's being communicated at what point in time and in what order they're receiving that information.
Thinking about your most recent example where you feel like you need to move a little bit faster, how do you balance urgency with patience with
Mhm.
stakeholders and board members to make sure that they give the space that you need to give to be successful, but then also you're pushing
Mhm. Mhm.
with a real sense of urgency?
Yeah, and I will be the first to say I'm not a very patient person, so I tend to err towards the fast track side. So I'm guilty of that. I think even in my most recent experience, so my board members have had to temper me and say, "Hey, Rome wasn't built overnight. It's okay to understand that this may take a little while." And I think it's important that every time you communicate, that you're providing some kind of tangible step forward. Like this has happened since the last communication or the last meeting. If you're just giving updates and the same updates every week, month, whatever it may be, there's no new information that things really made progress. Then I think that's where your sense of urgency maybe is called into question. I think you have to give like a tangible this has changed since we last met, spoke, whatever it may be. I also think in change management, mentioned pace and communication. I think you have to be mindful of balancing what may be perceived as a negative change with something positive. So I'll give an example that happened in the pandemic when I was working for another organization. We were in a grant making space. When the pandemic started, we were just a few weeks out from our annual grant awarding. Well, we didn't know how long the pandemic, March, April of 2020, we didn't know how long it was going to last. We didn't know what our impact would look like in terms of our financial abilities in the future to grant dollars to organizations. And so we said, we're going to have to we're going to go ahead and award the same grant you received last year because, we're going to be consistent just because everybody was in such a stage of uncertainty and panic. We are going to bring that down a little bit just because we don't know what our financial implication will be. Most of our fundraising happened the second 6 months of the year. So we were getting into that season and we don't want to overcommit and not be able to deliver on this financial commitment. However, in the past, when we had awarded grants, they had to be used for restricted purposes. And we said, we are taking that away because we know everybody's in a space right now where they're just trying to keep, in some cases, keep the lights on, keep their staff employed. So this is an unrestricted grant. So unfortunately, we had to take the grant down a bit, percentage wise for each grant recipient.
A lot more
But
freedom.
we said, but we are removing the restriction, and you can use it for whatever you need to use it for. We're not even going to, ask questions necessarily. So,
Yeah, my guess is most folks responded positively
mhm.
for a lot of reasons. But it raises an interesting point about how you can move effectively and make those real-time adjustments. What do you think the difference is between leaders and organizations that can operate effectively when circumstances change versus those organizations that get stuck?
I think when a leader, even a moment of uncertainty or when they've hit an obstacle, their ability to balance short term and long term at the same time is critical and not be reactive and make a short term decision that could have short term benefit at the expense of long term gains. And I think that's really important. I think when we get into a space of something coming up, we'll use the pandemic for example, and people get panicked or this is not something we've experienced before. It's easy to get reactive in that moment, and I think we just have to be careful about not trading in that long-term gain for short-term if you can avoid it. I also think I think in the case of the pandemic, a lot of weaknesses of organizations, nonprofits, companies, all different types of organizations were really exposed and exacerbated. So things that you maybe knew were kind of lurking under the surface that were an issue, they were blown wide open during the pandemic. And I think being able to hit those things head on and not stick your head in the sand and avoid or continue to not acknowledge that they're there is a differentiator between organizations that are successful in those moments or come out on the other side versus those that don't.
Yeah. I think about, and I've told this story before, maybe even to you, but I was laying in bed post-surgery December of 2018, and the organization I was leading was closing the year. We had about $400,000 in the bank, and we were spending roughly $150,000 a month. The budget had been approved already, and we had a seven-figure contribution that was gonna be coming in January. And we had the individual that was going to make that contribution reach out to me on middle of December, 36 hours post surgery, uh, to
Hopefully you were
say,
medicated in
I,
this moment.
well, I actually, my nerve block was still in the
Yeah.
leg, from the surgery. So,
So I
I
feel like I
was,
know where this is
yeah, I was
going.
wide awake. Yeah. Yeah. And they call and they say, hey, we've had a personal, circumstance, a life event happen. We're not going to be able to make this contribution. And my immediate thought when you're talking about the panic piece was, who are we going to fire? And
Mm.
I
That's the reactive
realized
nature,
it's
it's
a
human
reactive
nature.
nature. Yeah, and I'm sitting there, I can't walk, and I realized very quickly after that 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 was a $10 solution to a $100 problem.
Yes.
And so about an hour after kind of sitting with those thoughts, I called this person back and said, your personal life experience doesn't impact and change how you think about the mission of our organization. Would you be willing to call three of your friends
Mhm.
and have them write a check a third to a quarter equal of what you were going to make a contribution for? And would you be willing to push them to do it in the first quarter of the year? And we made some other strategic shifts in how we deferred some activity, but that happened in 2018, and we actually wound up closing the year because this person came back on in April with a 20% higher contribution than they had originally committed to. And so we closed our year, ironically, in the year that I thought we were going to go out of
Mhm.
business, with 700,000 in the bank. And we never looked back because it was a wake-up call to say, we've got to figure out how to be sturdy enough to survive these moments. So when
Yeah.
COVID happened, it actually gave us a competitive advantage because we had already walked through some of those paces
Mhm.
and had established kind of new ways in which to respond to uh, financial interruptions, to other things. And
Mhm.
I would argue that it empowered our organization to be even more mission focused because when threatened with loss of funding in other places, we got to evaluate that based on how does this loss or this gain impact what we're trying to accomplish and make really mission-based decisions as opposed to need-based decisions.
And I'm sure that donor appreciated the leadership that you demonstrated in that moment and the ownership that you took versus just saying, well, we're just going to fire people to, well, how can we try to turn this into a more productive solution? And so I have a feeling that's probably, a donor that you then kept on going forward. And you mentioned they increased their gift.
Yeah, they have been with the organization for many years. And I think I'm thinking back to your point about panicking with your staff. Um I had the good fortune of being at home when I got this phone call, not in the office, but
You could
uh
panic at home.
I panicked a little bit at home and but by the time I was able to get back into the office, had clearer head and you had the ability to, flag for the staff, we're gonna be fine, but we're gonna make some adjustments in how we're doing some of our work. I'd love to kind of in our last few minutes together, kind of turn toward um just you personally and kind of the growth that you've had over the
Hmm.
course of your career. You've had to make different decisions about where to invest your time and your energy. I'd love to know how you decide which opportunities to pursue and which ones to pass on, and what that does for you from a leadership perspective, and how that helps advance your particular
Hmm.
objectives.
And when you say opportunities, can you specify a little bit more?
Yeah, I think we're given both organizationally and personally, an opportunity to be on a podcast or an opportunity to speak at an event on a personal level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Organizationally, do I bring on this new funder? Do I take us into this new
Mm-hmm.
line of
Mm-hmm.
activity? Um, how do you think about saying yes to those things and or saying no to those things that allows you to feel really confident that you're
Mm-hmm.
making a strategic decision?
I think mission is so important. And at the Bridge to Excellence conference yesterday, I found myself in a conversation with another leader about, how important using mission and vision as your compass. We have an organizational mission and vision at CNE. I have a personal mission. And so when I think about, as I entertain different things that come up, either or, if it's, something professionally or organizationally, I think about, does it align with our mission at CNE? And if we can answer yes, to that question, then that's the most important first step. And then personally, I have a focus for driving community impact and enhancing opportunities for women. Those are two things that are important to me. And so that's what I consider when making a decision whether or not to take on an opportunity. And honestly, I try if it's at CNE and it does align with mission and vision, then I try to make it happen because we serve over 600 organizations in Middle Tennessee, and how we serve those organizations look as different as each organization is. So any opportunity that aligns with equipping and empowering nonprofits to excel and creating a thriving community with sustainable impact of nonprofits, which is our vision, anything that aligns with that, we owe it to our members to pursue it.
Yeah. I You've got an interesting career in that, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, um, isn't necessarily in a college academic catalog.
Hmm.
But one of the things that I think is so cool about your professional background is a number of folks could open up your LinkedIn profile or your resume and say, "Oh, I can see how I get from here to here. I
Yeah.
can follow the trajectory of exposing myself to lots of different opportunities, working in these different organizations." That it wasn't like trying to figure out how to become an astronaut, and by going to school to study engineering
Very
or
specific,
whatever.
yes.
That it's nebulous in that you have, I would guess, a hard time explaining to second and third tier in-laws at family reunions what exactly you do.
That's fair.
But it's I think it's a thing that a person could say and say, "Oh, I want to be in that role."
Hmm.
So I'd love to wrap up today as somebody is sitting here listening to this podcast, and I'm thinking about actual conversations I've had with folks that say, "I want to be able to do something like this someday," or "I
Hmm.
want to make a transition out of this corporate world into nonprofit community impact space." What is a piece of advice that you find yourself giving over and over again to people that see you and the work that you're doing and say, I want to be a part of that? I want to get involved in that sort of work. What do
Mhm.
you tell them? And how would you suggest that they think about advancing and pursuing that line of work?
Mhm. I'm a believer that every opportunity, every career opportunity that we find ourselves in prepares us for some future opportunity. Maybe not necessarily your very next job, but at some point down the road, things that you learn and that you experience in your current opportunity are preparing you for those future opportunities. And I don't want people to discount that or not really recognize that that's at play. And it's so important too sometimes, when you're going through a hardship professionally or experiencing something negative maybe at work, that too is preparing you for some future situation. There are things that I have been in my work at CNE drawing back upon nearly 20 years ago from one of my very first jobs when there's some parallels there. So, there's in every role that I've had, I can take something from that and apply it to my work at CNE. I also think it's important to understand too that we each own our professional development. Sure, we have mentors or probably supervisors or leaders that may take interest in us and help us try to get to the next step, but we have to take ownership of our own professional development. So if there's something we want to do, we need to connect with the people who are doing it and seem to be doing it well and learn from their story and their mistakes and their life lessons. We need to educate ourselves on that particular topic or industry or role and do all of the homework on our own. We can't depend on someone else to bring us along and do that for us. I think it's really important to understand every opportunity prepares you for the next opportunity or a next opportunity, and we have to take ownership of our own career and professional development
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You can't sit around and hope that somebody's just gonna find you under
and
a tree
tell
somewhere.
you the magic, secret or
Right.
how to get to, where you wanna be.
I would joke often when I launched the firm that I'm leading now that I just don't know where the client tree is for things to just fall off the branches, and you learn pretty quickly that well, it's because it doesn't exist.
Mhm, mhm.
It takes, to your point, kind of ownership of going out there and finding ways to be an advocate for your own future.
Mhm.
Well, Megan, thank you for your time and for sharing your
Thank you for having
perspective.
me.
It was really good to spend some time with you this morning, and I know your organization has gone through a lot of changes, and capturing that kind of in a real recent history.
Mhm.
I'd love to kind of catch you up over a coffee in about 3 years and see if you've got a different memory of how these things unfolded. But I appreciate your time this morning. This conversation has been a reminder that leadership doesn't happen by accident. It's built through intentional investment, shaped by experience, and strengthened through the systems and communities around us. Whether you're leading an organization or building a team, there's a clear takeaway here. If we want better outcomes, we have to be more deliberate about how we develop people. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating and a review and share it with someone who would find it valuable. We've got more incredible guests coming this season, so be sure to subscribe to Catalysts for Change wherever you get your podcasts, or visit us at catalystsforchangepod.com. Thanks again for listening to Catalysts for Change, brought to you in part by the Southern Research Collaborative. Until next time, I'm Adam Lister, and I'll see you soon.